The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as Natalie adjusted the hem of her apron, her mind buzzing with ideas. Brian sipped his coffee at the table, scrolling through emails on his tablet. "I've been thinking," Natalie began, her voice tinged with excitement. "What if I finally start my craft business? Full-time." Brian looked up, momentarily caught off guard. "You mean, leave your job?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I know it sounds risky," Natalie continued, her eyes lighting up. "But it's something I've dreamed of for years. I want to create something that's mine." Though Brian forced a supportive smile, unease gnawed at him. They had just started building a small nest egg for emergencies, and Natalie's income played a critical role. "If that's what you want, I'll support you," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of doubts in his mind. That night, as Natalie scribbled plans and sketched designs at the dining table, Brian lay awake in bed. The numbers from their budget spreadsheet ran through his mind like a broken record. The prospect of relying solely on his salary filled him with dread, but he kept his worries to himself. After all, wasn't it his job to believe in her? A month later, Natalie handed in her resignation. Her boss had been supportive, even excited for her, but as she walked out of the office for the last time, a pang of anxiety settled in her chest. "This is it," she told Brian that evening. "No more safety nets. Just my dream." Brian nodded, masking his own apprehension. Natalie converted their spare room into a studio, filling it with vibrant fabrics, paints, and tools. Each morning, she entered her workspace with determination, crafting unique items she hoped would one day define her brand. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of their decision began to show. Orders were sporadic, and the expenses of starting a business mounted quickly. Brian worked late nights, trying to offset their growing financial strain. "It's normal," Natalie reassured him one evening. "All businesses take time to grow." Brian forced a smile, but inside, he felt like they were walking a tightrope without a safety net. The tension between them began to seep into everyday life. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Brian's tone betrayed his growing frustration. "Maybe you could take on some freelance work, just until things pick up," he suggested, his fork hovering over his plate. Natalie's hand froze mid-bite. "I thought you supported this," she said quietly, her voice tinged with hurt. "I do," Brian replied quickly. "But we have to be practical." The conversation spiraled into an argument, with Brian pointing out the growing bills and Natalie defending the value of her dream. By the time they finished, the food had gone cold, and they retreated to separate rooms, each nursing their own frustrations. Later that night, as Brian scrolled through job boards for higher-paying positions, Natalie sat in her studio, staring at unfinished projects. The passion that once fueled her felt distant, overshadowed by doubt and the weight of Brian's words. The cracks widened during a family gathering. Over coffee and dessert, a relative asked Natalie how her business was going. She began to answer, her voice filled with tentative optimism, but Brian cut in with a dry laugh. "The business is still finding its footing," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "It's more of a passion project than anything else." Natalie froze, the words stinging like a slap. "Brian," she began, but he continued, oblivious to the hurt in her eyes. "We're still figuring out how to make it, sustainable." The room fell silent, the awkwardness palpable. Natalie excused herself, retreating to the bathroom where she gripped the sink, willing herself not to cry. Outside, the hum of conversation resumed, but the damage was done. For the first time, Natalie questioned whether her dream was worth the strain it had placed on their relationship. The drive home that evening was quiet, the tension between them thick. Natalie stared out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Brian glanced at her, guilt flickering across his face, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap he had created. In the weeks that followed, Natalie withdrew into herself. She spent long hours in her studio, but her creativity felt stifled. The once vibrant space now felt like a cage, filled with unfinished projects and unspoken fears. Brian, too, retreated into his own world, throwing himself into work and avoiding the conversations they so desperately needed. The distance between them grew, a chasm filled with resentment and unspoken words. Despite their silence, both knew something had to change. But neither was ready to take the first step. The silence in their home became unbearable. Natalie buried herself in work, though her enthusiasm had faded to a mechanical routine. Her once lively sketches now felt forced, and her designs reflected the weight she carried. Meanwhile, Brian stayed late at work more often, claiming overtime but secretly avoiding the tension at home. One evening, Brian returned to find Natalie already in bed. Her studio door was ajar, revealing an unfinished project on her table. For a moment, he lingered, observing the clutter of discarded materials and scribbled notes. It wasn't just a messy workspace, it was a reflection of Natalie's fraying spirit. He wanted to reach out, to tell her he saw her struggles, but his own frustrations held him back. Instead, he retreated to the couch, pretending not to notice the growing distance. A week later, another family dinner brought the tension to a boiling point. This time, Natalie's mother asked about her progress. Natalie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's slow, but I'm learning." Brian interrupted, his tone sharper than intended. "Learning doesn't pay the bills, Nat." The room fell silent, all eyes on the couple. Natalie's cheeks flushed as she forced a tight smile. "I didn't realize you felt that way," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Sensing the discomfort, Brian tried to backtrack. "I just mean, we're under a lot of pressure right now." But the damage was done. Natalie excused herself to the restroom, the murmurs of awkward conversation resuming behind her. In the quiet of the bathroom, she leaned against the sink, her reflection staring back at her. She barely recognized the person looking back. That night, Natalie packed a small bag and left without a word. She drove to her parents' house, seeking refuge from the weight of her failed dream and Brian's cutting words. When Brian returned home from work, the empty silence greeted him like a slap. Her absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. For days, Brian convinced himself that she simply needed time. He told himself she would come back when she cooled off, but as the days turned into weeks, her absence became harder to ignore. He missed the sound of her laughter, the sight of her hunched over her desk with a pencil tucked behind her ear. One evening, while scrolling aimlessly through his phone, Brian came across a photo of Natalie holding one of her first completed pieces, her face lit up with pride. It hit him then, he hadn't just lost her presence, he had lost the spark she brought to their lives. In her parents' spare bedroom, Natalie rediscovered her journals. Each page was filled with sketches and musings, a timeline of her hopes and struggles. She poured her thoughts onto the paper, capturing the pain of Brian's words and the weight of her self-doubt. "Maybe he's right," she wrote one night. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this." But alongside her doubts were glimpses of her resilience. She wrote about her first sale, the joy of creating something from nothing, and the belief that her work mattered. Her journals became her sanctuary, a place to process her pain and remind herself of the dream that once felt so alive. Meanwhile, Brian began cleaning out their shared studio, trying to distract himself from her absence. While organizing her supplies, he stumbled upon a stack of notebooks tucked into a corner. At first, he hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. Brian opened the first journal with trepidation, unsure of what he would find. The pages were filled with intricate sketches, notes about techniques, and personal reflections. One entry stopped him cold. "I wish Brian could see how much this means to me. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying. I just want him to believe in me." He read for hours, each entry a window into the parts of Natalie he had overlooked. He saw her struggles through her eyes, the nights she stayed up late perfecting a design, the rejection she faced with every unsold piece, and the quiet pride she felt in her small victories. By the time he closed the journal, tears blurred his vision. He had failed her in ways he hadn't even realized. This wasn't just about the business, it was about her. Brian knew then that he couldn't let her carry this burden alone anymore. Brian sat alone at the dining table, the ticking clock on the wall his only company. The house felt emptier than ever without Natalie. He missed the sound of her laughter, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air after she passed by, and even the clutter of her craft supplies scattered around the living room. The silence was unbearable. He tried to distract himself with work, but his thoughts always drifted back to her. "Maybe I pushed her too hard," he admitted one evening to an old friend over drinks. His friend, a practical man with a kind heart, didn't mince words. "You did, Brian. But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" That night, Brian wandered into Natalie's studio. It was exactly as she had left it, half-finished projects on the table, sketchbooks stacked neatly in a corner, and her favorite pen lying discarded on the floor. He picked up the pen, holding it like a fragile relic, and felt the weight of his regret settle deeper in his chest. Natalie, meanwhile, found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. Staying at her parents' house provided a temporary reprieve, but it didn't soothe the ache of her fractured relationship with Brian. Her mother, a gentle but practical woman, often joined her in the kitchen, offering quiet support. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old belongings, Natalie stumbled upon a photo of her and Brian from their early days. They were laughing, carefree, with no signs of the weight that now defined their marriage. The memory brought tears to her eyes. "I miss who we were," she whispered to herself, clutching the photo. That evening, as Natalie wrote in her journal, she considered reaching out to Brian. But fear held her back, fear that nothing had changed, that he still saw her dream as a failure. Instead, she poured her thoughts onto the pages, unsure if she'd ever have the courage to say them aloud. Brian couldn't stay away from Natalie's journals. He found himself drawn to them, not out of curiosity, but out of a desperate need to understand her. Each entry revealed layers of Natalie he had ignored, her fears, her hopes, and her relentless drive to prove herself. One entry stood out: "I know I'm not perfect, but why can't he see how hard I'm trying? Does he even believe in me anymore?" Brian closed the journal, his hands trembling. Her words pierced through his defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. He thought back to the nights she stayed up late, the mornings she woke early to package orders, and the countless hours she spent perfecting her craft. He realized, with painful clarity, how blind he had been to her efforts. Her dream wasn't a frivolous pursuit, it was a part of who she was. And he had failed to honor that. Tucked between the pages of one journal, Brian found a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, addressed not to him, but to herself. "Dear Natalie," it began, "it's okay to feel tired. It's okay to doubt yourself. But don't let that stop you from trying. You've come so far, and even if no one else sees it, you do. You're enough, Natalie. You always have been. The letter was like a dagger to Brian's heart. It was a testament to her strength, but also to the loneliness she must have felt. She had been her own source of encouragement when he should have been there for her. Tears streamed down his face as he folded the letter back into the journal. For the first time, Brian truly understood how much he had let her down. He knew he had to act, not out of guilt, but out of love. That evening, Brian picked up his phone and dialed Natalie's number. His heart pounded as the call rang, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, her voice came through, soft and hesitant. "Hello? Natalie," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been reading your journals. I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to understand. And now I do. I see how hard you've been fighting, how much this dream means to you. I'm sorry for everything, for not believing in you, for hurting you." There was silence on the other end, and Brian held his breath, waiting for her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Brian, I don't know if I can just come back. Things don't change overnight." "I know," he said quickly. "I don't expect you to. But I want to change. I want to be better, for you, for us. Please, let me try." Natalie's silence stretched on, but there was something different in it, a glimmer of hope. "I'll think about it," she said at last. It wasn't the answer Brian had hoped for, but it was a start. And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that they might find their way back to each other. After their phone call, Brian didn't expect immediate forgiveness, but he was determined to show Natalie he was serious about changing. Each morning, he sent her a simple message, "I'm thinking of you." Sometimes it was accompanied by a picture of something meaningful, a photo of her unfinished project in the studio or a sketch she had once shared with pride. Natalie, though cautious, found herself softening. She didn't respond every day, but when she did, her replies carried a flicker of the warmth they once shared. Meanwhile, Brian took concrete steps to support her dream. He began researching marketing strategies for small businesses, filling a notebook with ideas and resources he hoped might help. In her parents' home, Natalie noticed his efforts. Her mother, a quiet observer, remarked one afternoon, "He seems different, Nat. Maybe it's worth hearing him out." Natalie wasn't ready to return yet, but a part of her began to hope that things could truly be different this time. Determined to show Natalie he was invested in her dream, Brian decided to repair her studio. The space, once vibrant with her creativity, had become a symbol of their fractured relationship. He spent an entire weekend cleaning, organizing her materials, and even adding small touches like hanging fairy lights she had mentioned liking. When he sent her a photo of the transformed studio, Natalie's breath caught. The room looked inviting again, a place where her ideas could come to life. "I hope this feels like home," Brian's message read. Natalie stared at the photo for a long time, torn between gratitude and the fear of letting herself believe in him again. Later that evening, she sent a short reply, "Thank you. It looks beautiful." It was the first step toward a cautious reconnection, a bridge built on small but meaningful gestures. After weeks of reflection, Natalie decided to visit the house. She told herself it wasn't a permanent decision, just a chance to see the studio and talk to Brian in person. When she arrived, he was waiting at the door, his expression a mix of hope and nervousness. "I didn't know if you'd come," Brian admitted as he stepped aside to let her in. Natalie said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the clean, welcoming space. The scent of her favorite candles filled the air, and the studio door was open, revealing the inviting transformation Brian had worked so hard on. As they sat down to talk, Natalie laid out her feelings. "I need to know that this isn't just about fixing the studio," she said firmly. "I need to know that you believe in me, not just my work, but me." Brian met her gaze, his voice steady. "I do, Nat. And I'll keep showing you until you believe it too." In the weeks following Natalie's return, Brian made good on his promise. He didn't just support her business, he became her partner. He helped her redesign her website, taking care to highlight her best work. Together, they brainstormed ideas for marketing campaigns, with Brian ensuring her voice was at the center of every decision. Though hesitant at first, Natalie began to trust his input. One evening, as they worked on a social media strategy, she looked at him and said, "You know, I never thought I'd see you this excited about crafting." Brian chuckled. "It's not just the crafting. It's you. I want this to succeed because it matters to you." For the first time in months, Natalie felt a flicker of hope, not just for her business, but for their relationship. They were learning to work together as partners, rediscovering the connection they had almost lost. The craft fair felt like a milestone, not just for Natalie's business, but for their renewed partnership. They spent weeks preparing, with Brian handling logistics while Natalie poured her heart into creating new designs. On the day of the event, their booth stood out, vibrant and welcoming, a testament to their teamwork. Customers streamed in, admiring Natalie's work and making purchases. Brian watched from the sidelines, his chest swelling with pride each time someone complimented her craftsmanship. By midday, Natalie's booth was buzzing with activity, and a small line had formed as people waited to place custom orders. As the fair wound down, a woman approached the booth, her polished demeanor immediately catching their attention. "Your work is stunning," she said, handing Natalie a business card. "I'd love to discuss featuring your products in my store." Natalie's hands trembled as she accepted the card, her eyes wide with disbelief. That night, as they packed up the booth, Natalie turned to Brian, tears brimming in her eyes. "We did this together," she said softly. Brian pulled her into a tight embrace. "No," he whispered. "You did this. I'm just lucky to be a part of it." The glow of the craft fair's success lingered for days, but the journey was far from over. While Brian and Natalie celebrated their wins, reality soon reminded them of the challenges ahead. A week after the event, a shipment of supplies for Natalie's next orders arrived damaged, leaving her unable to fulfill several key requests. Panic set in as Natalie stared at the ruined materials. "These were supposed to be for the custom orders," she said, her voice trembling. "What am I going to do?" Brian placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said calmly. "Let's reach out to the customers, explain the delay, and offer something extra for the inconvenience." Though hesitant, Natalie followed Brian's suggestion. To her surprise, many customers were understanding, even appreciative of her honesty. It was a small victory, but it reminded her that she didn't have to face these hurdles alone anymore. Together, she and Brian navigated the setback, learning that their partnership was strongest in the face of adversity. Amid the chaos of rebuilding her supply chain, Natalie received an unexpected email. The store owner she had met at the fair wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss a potential partnership. Natalie's hands shook as she read the message aloud to Brian. "This could be huge," she said, excitement battling with nerves. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Natalie spent days preparing, perfecting her presentation and crafting samples that showcased her best work. Brian, ever the planner, helped her rehearse. "You've got this," he said, his confidence in her unwavering. When the day arrived, Natalie walked into the store's office, her heart pounding. The owner was warm and professional, praising Natalie's craftsmanship and vision. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to a trial run. Natalie's products would be featured in the store for 3 months. As she left, her head held high, Natalie felt a newfound sense of validation, not just in her work, but in herself. That evening, Brian surprised Natalie with a small celebration. He had cooked her favorite meal, complete with candles and soft music playing in the background. "What's all this for?" Natalie asked, her eyes widening as she stepped into the dining room. "For you," Brian said simply. "For believing in yourself, for taking that meeting, and for letting the world see what I've always known, you're amazing." Natalie blinked back tears as they sat down to eat. For the first time in years, she felt not just supported but truly seen. They talked late into the night, sharing memories and dreams they had once buried under the weight of their struggles. The evening marked a turning point, not just for Natalie's business, but for their relationship. A month later, Natalie's products were flying off the shelves at the store. The owner called to share the good news. "We're getting rave reviews, Natalie. Customers are asking for more." The validation was overwhelming, but Natalie knew she hadn't achieved this alone. At a family gathering, she hesitated to share the news, wary of the painful memories tied to previous conversations. But before she could say anything, Brian stepped in. "Natalie's business is thriving," he said proudly. "She's working with a store now, and her products are selling out." The room erupted in congratulations, and Natalie felt a surge of pride, not just in her success, but in Brian's unwavering support. That night, as they drove home, Natalie looked at him and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Brian squeezed her hand. "You deserve it all, Nat. I'm just lucky to watch you shine." With the success of her store partnership, Natalie's business hit its first significant milestone, turning a profit. As the numbers came in, Natalie couldn't believe her eyes. For so long, her dream had been a source of stress and doubt, but now it was a tangible success. She and Brian celebrated quietly at home, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. "It wasn't easy," Natalie admitted, her voice tinged with emotion. "There were so many times I wanted to give up." "But you didn't," Brian said, his tone firm. "You kept going, even when things were hard. That's what makes this so incredible." They clinked glasses, toasting not just to the success of her business but to the strength they had found in each other. As Natalie looked around the room at the studio she had reclaimed, the man who had fought for her, and the dream she had finally realized, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. As the weeks turned into months, Natalie's business continued to grow, and so did her relationship with Brian. One quiet evening, after finalizing an order for the store, Natalie found herself reflecting on their journey. "It's strange," she said, looking up from her work. "I used to think we were so far apart, but now it feels like we've found something even stronger." Brian smiled from across the room, where he was updating her website with customer testimonials. "I think we had to lose each other to really understand what we had," he said. "I'm just glad we found our way back." Their conversations became more open and vulnerable, touching on the mistakes they had made and the lessons they had learned. They both realized how much they had grown, not just as a couple, but as individuals. Natalie found strength in her ability to persevere, while Brian learned the importance of empathy and unwavering support. For their wedding anniversary, Brian surprised Natalie with a scrapbook. Each page chronicled her journey, from her early sketches to photos of her craft fair booth and the store displays featuring her work. "I wanted you to see how far you've come," Brian said, handing her the book. Natalie flipped through the pages, tears welling in her eyes. Each memory brought back the highs and lows of her journey, but also the moments where Brian had stepped in to support her. "This is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a celebration of you," Brian replied. "Of your strength, your passion, and everything that makes you extraordinary." They spent the evening reminiscing, their love for each other stronger than ever. To mark the one-year anniversary of Natalie's store partnership, the couple hosted a small gathering at their home. Friends and family gathered to celebrate her success, filling the house with warmth and laughter. Brian gave a heartfelt toast, raising his glass high. "To Natalie," he began, his voice steady and proud. "You've shown all of us what it means to dream big and never give up. Your resilience and creativity inspire me every day. I'm so proud of you." The applause was thunderous, and Natalie couldn't help but blush as she looked around the room. This was more than a celebration of her business, it was a testament to the strength of their love and the support of those who believed in her. After the guests had left and the house was quiet again, Natalie and Brian sat together on the couch, savoring the peace. The lights from her studio cast a soft glow, a reminder of how far they had come. Natalie leaned her head against Brian's shoulder. "Do you ever think about where we were a year ago?" she asked. "All the time," Brian admitted. "It was hard, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It taught me what really matters." Natalie smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. "Thank you for believing in me," she said softly. "Even when I doubted myself." Brian kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for never giving up, on your dream or on us." The following morning, Natalie and Brian took a walk through the park, their hands clasped tightly together. The crisp air was invigorating, a reminder of new beginnings. As they strolled, Natalie spoke of her plans for the future. "I've been thinking of expanding," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Maybe adding a line of eco-friendly products." Brian chuckled. "That sounds amazing. Let's figure out how to make it happen." They paused by a bench overlooking the lake, the sunlight dancing on the water's surface. "We've been through so much," Natalie said, her gaze thoughtful. "But I wouldn't change any of it. It brought us here." Brian nodded, his smile soft. "Here is exactly where I want to be." As they sat together, the challenges of the past felt like distant memories. They had built something unbreakable, not just a business, but a partnership rooted in love, respect, and the unwavering belief that together, they could overcome anything.